The presidency of the G20 shifts to the United States today under a cloud of diplomatic tension between Washington and Pretoria. President Donald Trump boycotted the Johannesburg summit and later announced that South Africa will be excluded from the 2026 gathering in Miami. In a televised address last night, President Cyril Ramaphosa called Trump's absence regrettable, firmly rejecting the allegations of genocide against Afrikaners as baseless and false, and he reaffirmed South Africa's commitment to constructive engagement within the G20. Despite the challenges and misunderstandings, Ramaphosa said South Africa remains a firm and unwavering friend of the American people. I have Chris Hattingh from the Centre for Risk Analysis in Joburg in the studio with me to discuss the fraught relationship between the Trump administration and South Africa. Hi, Chris. Thanks again for joining us.
Hi, Linda. Thanks very much for this great opportunity. Looking forward to our discussion.
Well, every time we think relations can't go any lower, they do. So how do you interpret this latest spat over the G20 summit in Johannesburg?
Look, I think based on South Africa's actions throughout its G20 presidency and at the summit, the Leaders Summit last weekend in Johannesburg, along with the priorities and agendas and values that South Africa put forward in terms of its presidency, in terms of the chair's summary that was announced. It wasn't a consensus, it was just a summary because the US wasn't in attendance and Argentina tabled their disagreement with it that they wouldn't sign on, so therefore it can't be a full consensus document in the sense thereof. In any case, taken all those factors, these kinds of ruptures were guaranteed this year between South Africa and the US in 2025, but also, of course, going back a few years, you had the Lady R incident, you had US Ambassador Brigitte and his concerns made public about South Africa's direction of travel and its diplomatic relationships. It isn't just that this has happened under the second administration of President Trump. This has been a long time coming. And little surprise that now after the summit and after South Africa handed over the presidency to a lower level diplomat of the United States, not on a higher level to President Trump or someone more sort of his station, perhaps Vice President Vance. I think it was no surprise that President Trump made these remarks and these comments. It also follows his and his colleagues' more transactional foreign policy, trade relationships, investment relationships, diplomatic relationships that he's tried to pursue in his second administration, where he looks for countries to bring things to the table that he views as in the US's interest. And if you don't come with that, I think he's going to find avenues of disagreement, be it ideological, be it policy, be it legislation, etc., etc. So, I mean, yeah, if I can say to people, who really enjoy this kind of thing, look forward to next year, because I think it's just going to continue. The threat that he might then say South Africa can't attend the summit, maybe they're going to withhold visas for South African representatives or something. He'll want to use this over South Africa going forward, because he'll know South Africa wants to attend the summit. South Africa is part of the troika in the G20 as the outgoing president. Now the US is the incoming president, and then the UK will host in 2027. So that those three are now the troika. President Trump, I think, will hold this over South Africa. He'll say, you can't participate in the troika or in the summit. Come to the table and tell me how you're going to deal with my disagreement and my administration's concerns about your country, about your diplomatic ties, about your economic situation. I think he's very good at finding different sticks and carrots to see how he can encourage, whether it be allies, trading partners, adversaries, how they react to him. Yes, the way in which he does it does often catch people off guard and by surprise. But I do think this kind of thing is guaranteed to happen throughout his second administration.
Is it likely that he could put pressure on other G20 countries to also, not be so friendly with South Africa?
I definitely think that's the case. He is doing things very differently. And as I say, the US is being more transactional in its foreign policy and trade relationships now. I mean, it's not different from what a country like China has done for many years, where it's not like it does benign investment or just purely benign trading relationships. The US is just now also on that kind of sort of trend. And when you have more economic leverage, more military leverage, in a more transactional geopolitical world, your leverage counts for a lot more than what other countries might have in terms of soft power. So when I talk about soft power, diplomatic standing, supporting platforms, multilateral platforms where you try to seek consensus, where you talk about values, about equity, sustainability, like South Africa is famous for doing, where South Africa has this moral superpower status. But in this world of more hard power and actual leverage, that soft power, what does it actually purchase you? Yes, the statement that was put out after the G20, it was flowery in the language, and there's talks about tackling all these challenges that countries around the world face. But when it comes to implementation, where's the leverage? Where does that follow from? So in terms of President Trump trying to pressure other countries in the G20, I think that will very likely be on the table. And it depends, of course, what form that takes. So perhaps with countries in Europe and with the UK specifically, President Trump could float the idea of increasing reciprocal tariffs once again if they don't distance or pressure South Africa. If you talk about investing in the US, if those countries don't up their investment, which has been a big thing he's pursued this year, along with his peace deals that he's tried to implement and secure with his own leverage. That could also be a way of pressure. He could, for example, talk to countries around South Africa and say, maybe South Africa, given its lack of economic growth and policies that inhibit capital formation that pose a risk to business and to capital in South Africa, things like crime, BEE, expropriation of property without compensation. If those things aren't addressed, are there other African countries like Rwanda, Angola, Kenya, maybe one or two others that feel they're bringing their sort of side of the bargain with the US more, and perhaps they deserve to have a seat at the G20 table in 2026. I think President Trump, in terms of the agenda, he's going to focus on especially the finance track and probably also the leader summit. So it's going to become a much more narrow agenda than what it has become, not only under South Africa, but for the last few years. As the US Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, he said earlier this year, he said it's become the G100 effectively because there's so many countries, and also just the agenda has become so bloated. So those things that President Trump and his colleagues are going to focus on, perhaps they'll try to incentivize other countries or directly pressure them to say, we disagree with what South Africa is doing. We disagree with the agenda that they've put forward in their presidency of the G20. Let's narrow the focus. Let's make it finance and investment and trade focused. What do you want to bring to the table? So I think there's a possibility of pressuring countries directly, and we'll see how he deals with each individually. I think he and his colleagues, they try and find either negative or positive reinforcements to different countries. They want to see where the pain points are, as it were.
Well, if you look at South Africa's relationship with the EU and with the UK, it's really good. Could he interfere with that?
Yeah, it is a very good relationship with many of those countries in the EU. From a values point of view, the European Union throughout this year has regularly talked about South Africa as a reliable and predictable trading partner, using those specific language. So very pointed in that regard. But again, soft power is one thing, and the values and the sentiment and the promises, that is one thing, and perhaps they will stick to it. I'm not saying, it's guaranteed that they won't, that they will cave to pressure. But when you're dealing with the US, that is the most important country in the world, economically speaking, yes, there are shifts here and there and might be more trade in some ways with a country like China. But when you talk about pure finance and capital weight and foreign direct investment, at the moment, it still all mostly comes from the United States. So he's got that pressure point. When you look at countries in Europe and the UK, others in the G20, dealing with lots of economic growth challenges of their own. I mean, the UK, just this week, we had the budget come out. Lots of issues around growth for countries like Germany, France, Italy in Europe itself. So there's that incentive for him to pressure them to say, not necessarily kick South Africa out of the G20, but just distance yourself a bit, maybe also start to criticize them, signal to me that you're agreeing with my concerns about the G20, about how South Africa handled it. Argentina, for example, they voiced their concerns about what South Africa put forward in the agenda, especially around the point of climate change policy. Perhaps other countries could be incentivized to do the same. So I don't think it's going to drive a massive wedge just yet. But these things, when it comes again to the economic and military leverage, given the economic relationship between the US and many European countries, and also from the military point of view, the US's involvement in entities like NATO, this is an unprecedented moment in foreign policy and geopolitics. Lots of things are on the table for discussion. It's no longer guaranteed that we can take things that have existed for the last 20, 30 years, these groupings, these multilateral platforms, for granted. I think the US is going to be more transactional for the next 4 to 5 years, possibly even longer. So it depends on how countries deal with that. Just maybe a last point on this specifically. Germany has been out of the blocks pretty early in saying South Africa should be at the table at the G20. Of course, no country can be kicked out of the G20 as such, because it's not a formal alliance. However, you can, I think, make it difficult for countries perhaps that you disagree with to attend. So that's why my first initial sort of stab at this is that President Trump and his administration, they might deny diplomatic visas to South Africans to attend. But countries like Germany have said South Africa should be there. We now need to see if others follow suit. It is a real test, I think, of the sort of multilateral platform, of this idea of consensus building, of having everyone around the table, where multilateralism is great on talk and on the values and on the rhetoric, but now we've got the hard power and the real leverage being a test of this multilateral platform.
Well, it seems in South Africa, people were quite keen on the way that President Ramaphosa treated this. He was saying that he was standing up against bullies. But when it comes to real consequences, and South Africa seems to have given up and said, we throw our hands in the air, we can't do anymore. What can the country do to change the situation?
Yeah, I think number one, it comes back to those policy reforms that the US has put forward throughout this year. They've communicated that through organizations like AfriForum and Solidarity. I was in Washington. I was fortunate enough to go twice to Washington this year. I met with various representatives. I'm not going to claim that I had any meetings in the White House or anything like that, but with representatives of Congress people. And they put forward the similar concerns to me in those discussions. So I would present to them from the CRA lots of economic data on South Africa, how GDP growth has looked, the economy, what are some of the policy constraints and what we recommend. And they would see, look, we want South Africa to grow. We want there to be investment. We want South Africa to be a reliable and proactive trading partner in sort of SADC and the sub-Saharan African region, Southern African region, but they're not doing that. So the policy reform is one thing. Also, South Africa sort of shifting its relationship with the US from it's been so aid-oriented to more investment-oriented and more trade, making sure that trade can flow easily. So basic structural reforms, things like more competition for, not even more, but competition for Transnet so that we get our ports and our rail up to stand. Dealing with crime is a big thing that often comes up, top issue in discussions with audiences around investing in South Africa and risks that they don't want to take on. So the more, I think, sort of responsible South Africa can be, proactive in owning its own issues in the country, I think, in terms of holding back growth, I think in that regard, that will really shift some of the perception around South Africa that is held in Washington.
Well, Chris Hattingh, thank you so much.
Thank you.